everyone. I know these videos are going a little long for this week, so I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to break them up so you've got some places to take breaks, collect your thoughts a little bit. This next video will finish up discussing the criteria for discussing appeals to authority arguments. So we have a few left of the criteria, and then we'll conclude this video by going through how to sort of combine the criteria together and what kinds of sort of evaluations and conclusions we can come to when we're looking at arguments that utilize an appeal to authority. Next up, we've got the idea of what's called peer review. Ideally, all expert testimony and the claims that an expert are investigating should have gone through the peer review process and been approved on the basis of it. So you all might not necessarily be familiar with the idea of peer review. It's predominantly only something that really occurs or makes sense in academic contexts. So, there's not really peer review in a lot of other fields. It really is something that predominantly occurs in an academic arena. The way peer review works, so this has happened to me, I've actually gotten a few articles published on ancient philosophy. What I had to do was write up the article, first of all, then send it to a couple of reviewers, and at least in academia, it's almost always blind review, where sort of my name was crossed off and I didn't know who was reviewing it, and the reviewer didn't know who I was. And these reviewers would read over my article and basically rip at the shreds. Say, like, you didn't prove this point well enough, you need to do more work here, you didn't consider this secondary source, what are you doing, right? Rip it apart, send it back to me, and say, do it again. Occasionally, some things get approved right away, usually not, right? So it was a very rough process for me, but indeed, at the end of it, right, I had made a much better article than I would have otherwise, because of this sort of peer review. So the peer review, it's a review of other experts of what it is that the expert is saying, and something that survives the peer review process is just this greater reason to think that it's trustworthy. It's not 100% trustworthy, it's not an infallible process. There are indeed issues with the peer review process, but it's better than something that hasn't been peer reviewed, at least. Right? It gives you a little bit more confidence, again, especially if it's a field you don't know about, that other experts have sort of looked and seeing what this expert says and give it sort of a thumbs up. Now, again, it's not going to be the case that every field that it's possible to have peer review in, again, mainly academic kind of questions, but if it is an option, if it is something in academia, you should sort of expect and want peer review. Alright, so there's one last thing we should expect anyone who's really an expert in some topic to be able to do. Experts should be able to supply us with sort of plausible arguments or explanations of why they're saying what they're saying. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here. The expert's not going to certainly be able to make us an expert in the field. If they could do that, we wouldn't need to appeal to authority. We'd become experts ourselves, and so we could actually just analyze the evidence and come to presumably the same conclusion that the experts have. But it is the case that experts can sort of like explain why they're saying the things they do to us in sort of highly simplified, sort of imagistic kind of ways, right? So maybe some of you are familiar with Einstein's theory of general relativity, and if you really wanted to be an expert and understand general relativity, you'd have to do like years upon years of math. But if you want to just watch a video and get like roughly what it's about, you've all, at least those of you who are interested in it, have probably seen videos or heard accounts of, dropping a bowling ball on a mattress or whatever, and using that as kind of a metaphor to explain what the theory says is going on. Similarly, doctors can be like, oh, you've got a bacteria, this penicillin is going to kill it. It's probably too simplistic. What's going on is probably far more complicated than that. And indeed, you would need a lot more knowledge to really understand all the mechanisms at play, but the kind of simplified explanation should at least give you enough to go on. Again, we can go way more sort of maybe everyday kind of context. If you go to a mechanic and the mechanic says, your car is broken, I'm going to need to fix it, and they won't tell you why it's broken, you'd be suspicious, right? You'd want to know, okay, give me something, right? To say something's wrong with the engine. You don't have to explain what it is exactly even, but you need to give me something. We should expect of our experts that they have the ability to sort of give us a rough idea of why they're saying the things that they're saying that can be understood by people who are not experts. However, we have to be really, really careful with this seventh condition, because the oversimplified explanation that the experts should be able to give us, it doesn't make us an expert. It doesn't actually put us in a position where we can evaluate between different claims to figure out what's true. There's a lot of highly simplified explanations of why things are true that are just nonsense or false. I mean, so, you hear, for example, cranks or sort of pseudoscientists they can give you sort of simplified stories of why something like, say, homeopathy. So homeopathy is something that has no evidence really to support that it works. But the homeopathic sort of salesperson who's trying to sell you and get you to buy the product can tell you a simple story as to why it's going to work. That doesn't mean that it's right. Reality is actually frequently way weirder, way more complicated than we ever would have guessed. And if we're relying upon these highly simplified explanations to figure out what's true, and we just sort of pick the simplified explanation that we like best, we're frequently going to get things really wrong. Again, I keep bringing up Socrates and Plato this week because I'm an expert in them, but also because actually they're both really concerned with this question of expertise. And in one of Plato's dialogues, he features this guy who's basically the equivalent of an advertiser today, what we would now call someone who's an advertiser. And this guy is sort of saying, his name is Gorgias, that, yeah, if I wanted to, I could persuade anyone that I'm more correct about medicine than a doctor is, because I can give a really clear, simple account, probably even a clearer and simpler one than the doctor will, and people will go along with me and ignore the actual expert. But that's dangerous, right? I mean, that's a severe problem when we're dealing with these appeals to authority. We ourselves can't really evaluate between different claims. These simplified explanations aren't enough to help us do that. So we should expect our experts to be able to give us a simplified explanation. But we shouldn't use those simplified explanations or treat them as if now suddenly we're experts in the topic too. We understand what's going on with it. All right, so now we've gone through our 7 criteria, but what do we do on the basis of it? Well, now we sort of have to sort of just weigh on the whole, how trustworthy does the expert seem to be on the basis of all of these conditions? And our answers can vary pretty wildly. We might be really satisfied based on these 7 criteria. This person is an expert, I'm going to trust them. That can happen sometimes. Other times, we're going to find some problems with the expert. Maybe they haven't yet peer-reviewed their claims. Maybe they do indeed have some conflict of interest. Maybe they disclose them, but still, they have some sort of potentially worrying conflicts of interest. But on the whole, we still think that they can be trusted more than not. And so, maybe we won't be quite as confident in our sort of in accepting their conclusion, but at least in the absence of any better evidence, we'll still go along with what they say. And then on the other hand, we're going to come into some scenarios where the violations of these criteria are so egregious that, yeah, we don't have an expert here at all. We have someone who's sort of a fake, someone who's pretending to be an expert in the topic that they're actually not. When we encounter scenarios like that, we're going to say that the argument is committing the improper appeal to authority fallacy. This is where the appeal is so weak that there's no real reason to think that the person who's speaking is actually an expert, or the person who's being appealed to actually is an expert in the relevant field. Alright, so that'll do it for this first video. We'll have a second video on chapter 2 as well. Because so far everything we've talked about is assuming that you're basically getting all of your information sort of from the expert, him or herself. Right? That the expert is the one speaking to you. Usually that's not true, though. Usually we hear about what it is that science says, or whatever, from things like the news media, things like social media, things like Reddit, Twitter, right? These almost like secondhand sources, right? People who are reporting about what they've heard the experts say. Or in a lot of cases, people who are reporting about things that they've heard other people report, that they've heard other people report, that maybe somewhere down the line some expert at one point might have said. That's a whole other level of complication just on top of these appeals to authorities. So we'll begin just focusing on these appeals, then we'll have a second video where we actually look at sort of some more real-world scenarios where we're dealing with really secondary sources, not things coming from the experts themselves. All right, so that'll do it for right now. See you in a little bit. Bye.